So, Dan, it's good to have you here today. We're just waiting for our distinguished LinkedIn members to join us today. Two boys from Boston. What a big deal this is. What do you think?
Indeed. Thank you for having me. I'm flattered. The boomers from Boston.
Well, yeah, actually, you know what? I gotta say, I gotta flash that on the screen. Well, I am the OK Boomer TV creator and lapel pin guy because I've got my where is it now? Oh, my lapel pin on here. Beautiful maritime ship. And
There you
yeah,
go.
we call this little fiasco here OK Boom Alive. And, two great guys from Boston. And it's funny how we kind of came to find each other, in terms of, I'd like to introduce my audience, the distinguished Dan Gardner. Dan is a new and old friend, and Dan is president of Trade Facilitators. Dan is a much in demand speaker, getting standing room only viewing at such distinguished events such as the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference. I remember the most funny thing about Dan is that he gave an impromptu session at TPM years ago, and there were like a couple hundred people in the room. And Dan, I just think it goes so strong about how people consider you such a leading thought expert in logistics, supply chain, ocean, U.S. free trade agreement, and our topic today, the future of U.S. trade with China. So I'm so pleased to have you.
Yeah, I'm flattered. People, we're actually, of course, both from Boston, both been in the industry a long time, but we've never met in person.
Yeah,
So,
that's the crazy thing about it is that and it's part of the whole thing. I think that with you and me, through the COVID-19 thing, we just kind of like went full force, and our bond is our work, right? And Dan, I was thinking between the two of us. I mean, I just interviewed Elaine Pofeld for FreightWaves Live, and it took me a long time to kind of come out as a solo entrepreneur, right? I always wanted my Fortune 100 clients to see this huge, machine in the background, right? What I do. By the way, I'm CEO of Ocean Audit. And when I came out and I just said basically everything that you do is me because I don't have any employees, and
right.
it's similar in some ways to yours. Your working
Absolutely.
process. You have team members and virtual folks, but I mean, geez, between the two of us, we probably have about 25% of the Fortune 100 as clients. So I just want the audience to kind of know that as the lead into our talk today. We really, Dan and I really conceptualized this series for two experts speaking, and I started thinking about everything happened with COVID-19 and Trump and the White House and China, and Dan and I conceptualized this session about a week ago. So we put it together, and would like to deliver it to the audience today. So Dan, welcome, and I'm glad you could join us, and look forward to your our mutual input on things. Dan, I got to tell you, it's funny. I I will. The audience will laugh at this a little bit, but I did acquire through some personal connections the personal emails of Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump at the White House, and I actually invited them to view this event. So I'm just going to go out and say, hi Ivanka and Jared, if you did join us, maybe
Yeah,
there'll be
welcome
something.
if they're on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe there's something you can tell to Donald about, how he can, either take the pedal off the metal, or take Dan's advice and move everything to Central America, and we'll go from there. But so Dan, I kind of get started on that about inviting. I actually invited Steve Mnuchin of Treasury. I mean, I'm really, you find me a real proactive type entrepreneur. I want to get the message across. I love the fact that you and I are going to talk about a really intensive topic today, and as a matter of fact, I am going to put a little banner up here that. For the audience, that at about the 35-40 minute mark, and I'm just setting a timer right now, we will field your questions on any comments. So any comments you want, put them in the LinkedIn comment box, and Dan and I will take them strategically as we go on.
Yeah.
Dan,
one quick thing, if I may. Jared, Ivanka, and Steve might be busy, but I'd like to point out that if it had not been for COVID-19, I would have been busy today myself, because I would have, as we speak, would have been in Nashville, Tennessee at my oldest child's college graduation. So he might be sleeping, but I think he might be watching. So I want to send out a shout out and congratulations to Nicholas Gardner. Congratulations.
Go Vandy. Go Vandy.
Right on. Vanderbilt University, baby.
Love it. Harvard of the South. I love it.
There you go.
Congratulations on that, Dan. And
Thank
I'm
you.
so sorry that the day was ruined. But I think that structurally, when we talk about U.S. trade with China, we're in a whole new ether sphere, so to speak, here. Dan, I was looking at some informal comments. I looked at the news wires, and one senior White House official said we should drop the blank word, the hammer on them, meaning China. How did we get to this point, Dan, in terms of where trade has facilitated between the U.S. and China? With COVID-19, where are we at right now, and what are the short and near-term potentials for either retaliation on China or a more modified approach?
Yeah, that's a big question. How long do we have this morning?
We don't want to bore the guys on session, but so what is the big picture in terms of like Trump has the nuclear option to, and it's just funny how he's not come out and said one way or the other. He's really vacillated on what the Chinese have bought phase one on exports, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But really, where do we stand right now, Dan, in your humble opinion, with importers, exporters, the China option, and next steps?
Okay. Well, I'll begin by saying that China isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and our business relationships with them, I believe, are so deep rooted, especially imports from China, that our business relationships with them will continue. One of the things that I pride myself on is at least trying to be a student of the game. We've been in the logistics and supply chain space 30 plus years each, and I've been to China a number of times. I lost count, to be honest. And one of the things I always tried to do was listen to people, get factory tours, talk to people that know more about these things than I do, and form a well-informed opinion. So our business history with China goes back to the early 1980s, when the then premier Deng Xiaoping made a commitment to convert China into an export-oriented, manufacturing-oriented society. So there are companies today, predominantly importers in the United States, that have literally been doing business in China for 40 years. So there's a pretty substantial head start, if you will, that China has on other countries. You mentioned Latin America. We'll get into that later a little bit as well. But the ability to break those links and move to the buzzword countries like Vietnam and what have you, that's not an easy thing to do when you talk about hardcore topics like product engineering, design, production capacity, diversity of products that China makes. They will make anything that you want. So even going back to the Trump tariffs, the original Section 301 tariffs, as they're officially called, 25% on products that were previously 0%. There's been movement out of China, but not as much as one would suspect, because it takes time to develop relationships. You have to travel to a Vietnam, you have to travel to Mexico, meet vendors, vet them out, get product samples. This is a complex undertaking. So I'll begin by saying I'm not a China basher. If you look at our with China from a business perspective, they are a supplier to us of everything you can possibly imagine. They're a customer for us for our exports from the United States. In a symbiotic sense, they're a competitor of ours in other markets. And in a geopolitical sense, we're not exactly aligned. So there's a lot of variables in a highly complex conversation. So The thing that surprised me most about the Section 301 tariffs was that companies didn't move quicker, or at least they're being more circumspect in making their changes. Now, if President Trump goes on to issue other tariffs and or non-tariff barriers to trade, I think that will accelerate, certainly exacerbate the situation, and it might be different. But China isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Well, Dan, I totally 100% agree with that. And, one of the things that I found, and I have some of the best research numbers in the world, one of the things that you and I talked about the other day when we practiced talking about the session today was the fact of what I found in terms of just raw numbers, and the fact that the China import individual invoices. I look at things a little differently the way I slice it. I like to look at the amount of shipping invoices, not necessarily containers, that come out of China.
Right.
And Dan, I'll tell you, I am just stymied, and I'm trying to get an idea on, your thoughts on this. The number that I have here on the screen, the next closest number in terms of velocity was about 500,000 over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. So why the floodgates open now? And has this velocity, and we are reading it now, all of a sudden, we're seeing it in JOC and freight waves, and other people are talking about the fact that the floodgates are open, the China is back, but these numbers are astronomical on the imports. What might they mean in terms of the tea leaves? Could some of this be potentially really savvy importers front loading and getting ahead of a possible Trump retaliation? Could it just be the insatiable need and pent up orders for the for the nail clippers and the low cost items? What's your take on this?
Yeah, when we did speak the other night, you got me thinking, and I've been doing some additional research and again talking to people in the know on this subject. I think it might be a combination of things. Number one, let's not forget that before the word came out on COVID-19, which officially word came out from a company out of Canada called Blue Dot, this risk management software outfit, very sophisticated algorithms, that the economy was booming. And companies that buy in China typically place their purchase orders 90, 120, even 180 days in advance, betting on that hot economy continuing down the road. So I think there's some of that carryover from excitement and optimism about the economy itself. I think it had a fair amount to do also with the original supply shock, where importers were panicking about being able to get goods out of China because China had originally shut down. So they're scrambling like crazy, placing more and bigger purchase orders. So I think it's a combination of things, to be honest with you. Now, there's always a lag, obviously, whether it's 30, 60, 90, 120 days. Maybe that'll soften up a bit, but let's not also forget that, especially in the retail space, and this, that the big and small importers, as I said, are placing importers early so they can get stuff in, because they're what's referred to as cumulative lead time can be 90, 120, 180 days, and they're prepping up now for back to school and then the holiday season. So I think it's a combination of those dynamics, to be honest.
But Dan, the numbers are so big, and the timing may be right for U.S. policy to look at a way to open up factories in Muncie, Indiana, and in Nogales, and to move some of the manufacturing. We have a chance here. I guess my question is, in your client base, do your clients believe that the products are coming out of China are not irreplaceable? In other words, is there, because they're labor intensive items, are you finding that we just can't get away from the insatiable appetite for these items?
I think the appetite, at least pre-COVID-19, will always be there. We are a consumption society, but talk of nearshoring, which I am a fan of, not as easy as it sounds. There's a cost differential that has to be considered, which is to say, if we nearshore certain industries, the simple math is that those products, you mentioned nail clippers, you can forget about the 50-cent nail clippers at Walmart, because they're going to be $3-4 each. Because if they're made in the United States, we have a higher cost structure, real estate, production, certainly labor. What I think people really need to understand, and I've had clear in my mind since the first time I went to China over 20 years ago, is that in global markets, not just with China, we can't compete on price alone. We just can't. And that's footwear, that's wearing apparel, it's all the stuff you see in retail. We have to be developing high-end products that can sustain high labor, where people can enjoy a good living working in these types of facilities and environments. But if we think we're going to nearshore shoe manufacturing or wearing apparel, that's a patriotic thing to do. But as my mom used to tell me, touch my wallet, touch my heart. And I think you'll see that patriotism dissipate when a pack of white gym socks goes from $4 to $12. People might change their mind a bit. So I think we need to work on our manufacturing base for sure. But a la Germany, whose labor rates are very similar, if not higher than the United States, focus on high-end, export-oriented manufacturing, products that people can't get in other places and are willing to pay a premium for, because we cannot reshore some of the low, I should say, high labor content industries.
But Dan, let's talk Turkey about this a little bit, because we talked the other night, and the wages in China for, let's say, a very intensive labor type product, $3.50 an hour versus say $20 in the U.S. So one of the things that I have a colleague that's an economist in Beijing, and she was telling me, I said, give me some stats that I can use for our webinar. She goes, well, we have this new category we're tracking. I said, what's what new category? She said, well, we're tracking labor intensive products, how much of the market we're losing. And she said they lost 31% in renminbi value this quarter over last quarter, even taking in consideration Chinese New Year. Now, my question is, where are those products going, Dan? I mean, India doesn't have the infrastructure. Now, we also did see that the decline in trade from Asia to Europe was only about half of what it was in the U.S. So let's help put the puzzle pieces together, because labor-intensive goods are a huge issue with China. I think we all agree. We have clients that do this. So where are the labor-intensive goods potentially going, and what can we do as importers to accelerate the process of resourcing?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to those high-end, high-tech products, there may be a decrease because they're capital goods. Overall,
I'm talking about the lower value and labor intensive items, like apparel or manufacturing of sporting goods or whatever.
Yeah, well, long before COVID-19, China was having challenges to begin with, because especially coastal China, their labor rates were going up, real estate was becoming more expensive, so that translated into higher per unit costs, even on these lower end items. So people were at least talking about going to other places like Southeast Asia. That was a trend that was going on. Again, more than likely accelerated by the current circumstances. So you start thinking about where some of this stuff can go. Because again, if you think about reshoring to the United States, some of these lower cost industries, my question would be, before COVID-19, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. So these are labor intensive industries. Where are all these people coming from if the unemployment rate was already 3.5%? That's a rhetorical question at this point in time, because it would be very difficult to fill those factories. So we have to focus, and I'll answer your question in a second, but we have to focus as the U.S. high-end, highly desirable products that catch a premium price, and continue to outsource some of this other stuff, footwear, wearing apparel, etc. So where does that go? Well, I look at it this way. I worked in Latin America in the logistics space, 13 years living and working in Latin America, and I continue to do a lot of work there. Lived in Mexico for 4 years, lived in Colombia for a year. And one thing I've learned and pay attention to, as an example to answer your question, is that the United States has 20 free trade agreements with countries around the world. 12 of them are in the Western Hemisphere. Canada, Mexico, all of Central America, including the Dominican Republic, as part of the Central American Agreement, Colombia, Peru, who am I missing? Chile. So the potential exists to have those industries, companies start sourcing from those countries. Look at Mexico. The USMCA, the US Mexico Canada Agreement, goes into effect July 1st, duty free on items. Closer, shorter lead times, labor probably a little bit higher, but you can make up for that on the shorter lead times and transportation costs. So there's a big opportunity there. With that said, if you took the production capacity, and I've not done this, so it's a hypothetical, but if you took the production capacity of Mexico, Central America, and the free trade countries in South America, I don't know what it is, but if it added up to a total of 10% of the production capacity just of Guangdong province in South China, that would be a lot. So we have to be, again, circumspect in how companies go about doing that, and encourage both governments that we have these free trade agreements with and business people to develop an infrastructure. The other thing is the assumption that whatever we get in China, we can get in Mexico or India or somewhere else, simply not true. They just don't make the diversity of products. The other point is, and I learned this living in Mexico, is that even if you have a producer of finished goods in Mexico, Colombia, where have you, they're going to get their raw materials probably from China, because that ecosystem, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers are not there. When I was living in Guadalajara in Mexico, we worked with all the largest contract manufacturers that made the laptops and the cell phones and what have you. And we were bringing in all the raw materials from Asia via Los Angeles, moving a couple thousand tons a month. That's a lot for people who aren't familiar with that figure. That's a lot, a couple million kilos a month via Los Angeles from Hong Kong just into Guadalajara, because they didn't have the infrastructure, the ecosystem for raw materials. So you can't just say, oh, let's move everything to Mexico. Let's move everything to India. Don't even say it about Vietnam, because they don't have the infrastructure either. So this isn't an election cycle thing in terms of timing. It's a long-term strategic approach. And I think as a country, since we opened our doors to cheap imports with the Trade Act of 1974, by the way, we have not had a collective, unified strategy for how to deal with globalization, because we were the authors of globalization in the post-World War II world, starting with the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, to its transition into the World Trade Organization. We did all these things. So I don't disagree with President Trump when he says, for example, that China has been taking advantage of us. They have, and it's what essentially a capitalistic society, so they should. But the only reason why they have is because we let them.
Dan, you know, this is a perfect segue, I think, to give the audience some more color on this. I think, you know, a few things that we talked about the other day were really interesting. And, you know, one of the things that came out of the administration, I think, is the thought that the Chinese were potentially hoarding some of the PPE as it relates to getting the product into America. Now, my own very own ocean audit data tends to support that. Last year at this time, we had about 3,000 containers of standard PPE. And this year at the same time, we have about 2,300 containers. Now, of course, I understand PPE in a time of crisis also goes by air freight. However, the thought process is that maybe you know, some of the PPE that was designated for us went to Europe, and that's why the Europeans didn't have such a decrease in their trade with China that we did. Now, the other thing that I wanted to just, you know, share the audience is the fact that it's clear that the Chinese are not honoring their phase 1 part of the agreement on export buys. I mean, look at these numbers on the export issues with regards to what China is buying from the U.S., and they just simply are not doing it. So my question, Dan, to you is, are we at a point where we've entered a phase of perhaps a decoupling between ourselves and China, and it could be an isolation point with our allies and the rest of the world? Is it we against China, or is there another phase, another intermediate phase that the administration and importers and exporters can look forward to?
Well, I think the administration can make it that way if they impose additional tariffs or even non-tariff barriers to trade. That's a wild card that we just don't know the answer to. But I look at it this way. Obviously, China's a huge player, but it's called globalization for a reason. And companies, both in the import and export environment, are looking for places to buy and sell products that enhance their capitalistic value proposition. If there are options in terms of product variety, product quality, unit cost, landed cost, et cetera, companies will pursue that. As I said earlier, and I'll reiterate now, take the wild card that I alluded to a moment ago out of the equation. I don't believe that business with China is going anywhere because A, we're so linked to them now. They have all that variety, production capacity, et cetera. But here's the other thing, and we saw this already. In a trade war, it's not a one-sided affair. People are going to react. So we put up tariffs, another country puts up their tariffs, and that's obviously going to impact our exports. And I don't think, especially now, to put on more tariffs would be a wise thing to do. As it goes, as far as exports go, let's talk in general. And I think it's telling, and maybe people know this that are on and maybe not, but before COVID-19, I know you know the answer to this question. What was America's largest maritime export by volume, meaning by containers?
Waste paper, of course.
Waste paper. To be shipped where? To China, to be recycled, to package up all the stuff that we buy from them. What was number two? Scrap metal, plastic, rubber, etc. So while we became a consumption society and enjoyed the benefits of that, inflation-free markets for the better part of 40 years, directly tied to cheap imports, we sacrificed our manufacturing base and exported our know-how, and we're in a position now where we'll end up playing catch up. But if you go back to the ag exports, for example, that China had committed to buy certain amounts and what have you, based on the figures, it looks like they should be buying even more.
Well, Dan,
But
that's
then,
just that's the point, though, Dan, is that, if you look at Trump's news conferences lately, he gives one line to it. They should be buying, they will be buying, we're going to be watching that. The reality is that they've aced us. That they're not going to act. They're not going to do that. We're still have an insatiable amount of imports coming in. We're at the point now, Dan, where the ocean carriers are having to do detention in transit and store
right?
containers around the world to
Yeah.
support the burgeoning amount of product coming in. Now, my question is, and this is really interesting. I saw this last night, so I didn't, this is new news to you, but I read a report from the global consulting company Kearney, and Kearney said that they showed a dramatic reversal of the 5-year trend in domestic U.S. manufacturing compared to 14 select Asian exporters that they tracked in the study, and they showed that the manufacturing imports from China were really the hardest hit, especially the labor-intensive goods. And companies are just either opting out of China or asking vendors to resource to other countries. My question, though, is if you're sourcing in China and your Chinese vendors move their plant to Vietnam, and it's got that Chinese ownership, could there be perhaps another layer, a wild card that we hadn't considered, where all of a sudden, if it's the U.S. against the China, does ownership matter? Do you think that could ever possibly come into play, where you've got a Vietnamese production plan of textiles with the Chinese ownership, and then now you have other trade regulations that perhaps prohibit dealing with the Chinese? Do you ever see that as a hammer?
Yeah, well, to answer your question, it already happened going back into the early 1990s, and we're a little bit of a history lesson here. But the Trade Act of 1974 opened the door to cheap imports, and the primary beneficiaries of that were Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong. And I'm going back some years now, and those highly advanced societies today started out doing what? Exporting wearing apparel, footwear, the labor-intensive stuff, looking to create jobs in there. In the 1990s, I want to say, yeah, mid-1990s, what was called the Generalized System of Preferences, which was the program under which those countries could do that, those 4 countries got taken off of GSP as part of the Section 301 part of the Trade Act. So what happened? As I said, I was working in Latin America for a long time. I was working Central America, the islands, South America. There was a movement, literally brick by brick, of factories from those countries, South Korea, Hong Kong, which of course is now part of China, Singapore, etc., that they moved the factories to Central America. And I can remember that this isn't secondhand information. Being in factories, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, in Costa Rica, in a wearing apparel factory that we were visiting on behalf of one of our high-profile, still in business today, retailers. And there were 400 people working the lines and 4 guys from South Korea running the factory. So it's already happened. And I'm quite sure that it's going on now. So the way trade policy is structured today, we don't look at ownership, we look at country of origin. And that's the thing. And if you talk about Vietnam, that's been going on anyway. And for the first time, just the other day, because I pay attention to these things, Vietnam started out, again, classic wearing apparel footwear model, create jobs, labor intensive, and then graduate to more industries, which is precisely what China did. And for the first time, we went online and bought some Apple products, accessories. And I'm one of these people, if I go into a store or I buy something online and I get it, I never look at the price first. I look at the country of origin. That's a little bizarre, but that comes from being a licensed customs broker for 30 years, I suppose. And for the first time, I got these accessories from Apple, and they were made in Vietnam. And that surprised me. So I'm not saying that those factories are owned by Chinese vendors, but I'll tell you for sure that Vietnam is evolving. And that's what globalization was intended to do, going back to this Trade Act and the GATT and all this business, was to give countries the opportunity to embrace capitalism and democratic structures and become part of the global community. So countries succeeded at that, and now we're turning around and saying, oh, wait a minute, that's not fair. Here's the deal. We as a country have to be able to compete in global markets, and we're never going to be able to compete just on price alone. Straight up, end of story.
Dan, one of the things that I recall years ago, somebody wrote a story about this in, I think, New York Times or Wall Street, and somebody said, well, I'm true blue American, I only buy American made. And the reality is, if you sit down, right, and I invite the whole audience to comment on this, you look at what you have within 5 feet of you, what you're wearing. I would suffice to say, and I don't know if you would agree with me, but 75, 85, 90% of what you have or what you wear or what you touch, the keyboard, the computer mouse, it's all made in China. So, I mean, we have an excessive, incredible demand for cheap Chinese goods. Now, I'm the first one to say, China has made me a self-made person, right, in terms of my business, because my clients do business there and I help them in China. I guess my question is if you look at what's happening now in e-commerce, for example, or because of COVID-19 and retail store closures, right? You look at the numbers I put up on the screen a few minutes ago about how large the amount of imports that are coming in right this minute are. But at the same time, it's going to be a while before we're fully profiled and the malls are open and we're back to the stores. My question, Dan, is could somehow this COVID-19 event and the dramatic increase in e-commerce reshape the way that we buy, which I think I think I know the answer, and B, the way we source the supply chain?
Yes and yes, but maybe not to the extent that people think, because by human nature, people, even in a time of crisis, have a tendency to gravitate back to their normal circumstance after that crisis passes. As it relates to consumption behavior, I think more and more people have been compelled, have had to buy online. Look at groceries, for example. People that perhaps never bought groceries online before did now, and they might be saying to themselves, well, that's not a bad idea. Maybe I'll keep doing this even after the fact. So I think there's going to be a fair amount of that for sure, and not just groceries, other things as well. As far as the sourcing piece goes, I believe that to be true. And I come back, albeit in a biased sense, because again, I've spent so much time in Latin America. You look at Mexico and Central America. Doesn't have the production capacity of China by a long shot, but we have free trade agreements with that region, Central America, as well as Mexico. We have the opportunity to do more business with them. And you link that up with the challenge we have with people coming into the country by other than legal means. If someone's willing to walk 1,500 miles to get to the US border in the hopes of getting into the country and pursuing a better life, they're highly motivated. But my experience has been, especially in those countries, is that if people have their druthers, they'd just as soon stay where they are if they had a decent job, if they could get a good education for their kids, if they could leave their kids in a position to do better than they did. So why not create a structure through incentivization to take advantage of existing free trade agreements? They're there today, zero duty rates, to encourage companies to, yeah, keep the high tech, the high end, high wage stuff here in the United States, but outsource to these countries, create some jobs so people don't have to walk 1,500 miles to get to the US border. How about linear thinking along those lines and tie these things together, not treat them as silos like they don't impact one another?
Dan, that's an excellent thought. We're getting some great comments from the audience, and I'll join them in on a few minutes here. But let's go inside the war room. At a retailer in the U.S. and you've got the controller, CFO, VP of merchandising. By the way, did you, like I said, the war room? We got two guys from Boston parking the car, right, Dan?
Yeah, we'll have some beers afterwards and go have a lobster roll while we're at it.
Yeah, I think when I get a little tired, my R's start to go back to Revere.
I hear you.
But back to the war room type scenario, when you look at retailer X, and certainly some retailers have really got their hands around moving out of China quite quickly before the 301 tariffs. But I mean, if you're looking at it right now, what does sourcing outside of China really mean to these executive decision makers at a retailer? I mean, what kind of conversations are going on behind the scenes that we can kind of help facilitate? I mean, are these executives asking their merchandisers, why can't you buy this in Mexico? Why can't you buy this in Honduras? Why can't you buy this in India? What does it all mean in terms of companies that want to look to source outside of China?
Yeah, and you said the magic word, sourcing, because sourcing is different from purchasing. Sourcing is a longer term strategic undertaking where retailers, and I've been on these sourcing trips with them, that Central America anecdote I shared is an example of that, but other places too, India, China, Southeast Asia, etc. Sourcing is typically within an organization. To answer your question, a war room is a group of people, let's talk large retailers, that are 2 or 3 years ahead of the purchasing people, because the purchasing people are doing just that. They're buying stuff from established vendors, established contractual prices, all of those things. So the sourcing people have to be 2, 3 years ahead, looking at trends, looking at industrial development in different countries. So strategically, they're looking further out. So my answer to your question would be those companies, I'm sure that they were already looking at that opportunity, at those opportunities. One part of the world we haven't talked about, that the U.S., it's not a free trade agreement, but it's a preferential duty program. It's called the African Opportunity Growth Act, something like that. I might be getting it wrong, but essentially offering preferential duty on wearing apparel, footwear, high labor intensive products, just like the United States did back in the early 80s with Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan and South Korea. So those companies that you spoke of a moment ago, they're in Africa. If you look at Europe, they've already done their sourcing work from a couple years ago. They're buying from Tunisia. They're buying from Morocco, who the United States has a free trade agreement with, by the way. They're in Egypt. So the answer to your question is, I'm quite sure, because I deal with these people, not all of them, but a lot of them. We're doing that anyway, looking for other sourcing opportunities, and smaller to medium-sized enterprises that don't have the resources to have a sourcing department and a purchasing department, because most companies, smaller ones, medium-sized ones, they do both, have to be making the investment in doing those things. The trouble starts when companies' profitability goes down, due to, in part, to the Section 301 tariffs, due in big part to slack sales from COVID-19. They just don't have the working capital and the profitability, the operating income, to invest in those future activities. So the question becomes, is it a vicious cycle where we're just kind of stuck where we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I'm trying to multitask and have three screens, and I'm looking at the feed, and I want to
Yeah,
give a
let some people opine here.
yeah, I
What
want
are
to give
we?
a shout out. That's exactly right, to John,
I
a
can't.
good friend of mine, John Monroe, and Dan Krasenstein. Dan and I spent time in Taiwan together back in the '80s at Sealand. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that Dan had actually made a comment that buying from India is wholly different than buying from China on many levels. And you and I talked about that, Dan, when we talked about India's got its own problem with infrastructure. So, what do you think
Definitely.
about that opportunity?
Great point. And I've not met Dan, but we've spoken a number of times on LinkedIn. We were supposed to get together at the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference, but we didn't have an opportunity to do that. So I'll send my digital greetings to him. I look forward to having a cup of coffee or a lunch someday. But he's absolutely right, because India is entirely different. It's a big country. Number one, the infrastructure in terms of highways and bridges and ports and such has improved dramatically over the years, but still has some work to do. The industrial base, India, as a strategic decision upon becoming a sovereign state in 1948, focused a lot on technology. What we all know how adept the Indian economy is on the high tech side of things, especially intangibles like software and things of this nature. So I don't think that they have the production base of a China either, in spite of the fact that they have almost, if not more people, and a very large landmass. So I would agree with that entirely.
And it's funny, in retrospect and looking at a comment from John Monroe. John was talking about how Walmart's online sales increased 40% in 2019, and he says, imagine the online sales growth under COVID-19. And before we comment on that, I looked at Amazon Logistics. The SCAT code is AMZD, and their fulfillment by Amazon cargo coming into the U.S. I've never seen such velocity of containers, even in the last several weeks. There was some talk about Amazon that we're going to kind of tamper down our our normal stuff, and just use the logistics supply chain to move in PPE. Well, I get it. I mean, certainly air freight. I'm not an air freight guru. I'm an ocean guru, but everything I see on ocean is really the low end, real commercialized items that just are selling like hotcakes. Kramer from CNBC on Mad Money said, the best stocks now are like Activision, Take Two, Nvidia, anything that's really in the home environment, right, where we're going to be sitting there and playing our games. So John's comments that Walmart sales are really sky high right now, and Amazon. Let's talk about that for a second. How does the potential shaping of the retail economy into, say, a few superstores, super brands, reshape how we might deal with China?
Yeah, well, I do know John. We've met many times, seen each other at different venues. I have immense respect for his knowledge. I know he's lived and worked in China and other places his whole career. So he is an authority on international trade, and people should listen to what both he and Dan have to say. But you mentioned Amazon, for example, and fulfillment by Amazon. And this is public information. You can read it in their annual report. And Amazon is proud of it. Upwards of 53% of their business, as it relates to tangible goods, products, is through fulfillment by Amazon, which is to say, independent importers that are buying in different countries, but certainly China are using Amazon as a platform, both digitally and from a physical distribution perspective. So it's not just the stuff that Amazon is bringing in themselves, but also their FBA customers. And I think that will continue to grow. I mean, if you think about it, whether it's digitally or out in the physical world, in our country, what do people do when they get bored? They go shopping. I mean, I have stuff now. All three kids of mine are home, so I understand there's a different dynamic. But I have stuff showing up on my doorstep daily, and I don't even know what it is. So I think people are just buying more. Part of it is psychological; they're bored out of their minds. So I think there's some of that. But the dynamic, to answer your question, big box retailers, I think they're going to continue to be around for a while. They'll continue to transition into e-commerce. But the growth in e-commerce and the way goods are delivered, especially now I'm talking last mile logistics, reverse logistics for returns and such, that's only going to enhance that business model. I mean, envision for a second the use of drones, and companies like CVS, UPS are experimenting with drone deliveries. And this might sound a little like the Jetsons from when we were, kids, super fantastical. But imagine a scenario where you're sitting in your house next to Alexa and you're waiting for a prescription to be delivered, and Alexa comes on and says the drone's going to be at your house in 2 minutes.
Yeah,
That will happen in 5 years or less. So it's that type of innovation, to take us back to the earlier point about the ability to compete, that's going to drive the U.S. economy forward. And I'd ask questions like whether it's warehouse automation, robotic drones. These are all very important innovations. Where are those actual products, the drones, the robots in the warehouses, where are they being made? We need to be making them, because if you go into a factory in the United States, and I've been in plenty of them, successful organizations that do sell high-end products, and I look at the production equipment, and it's made in Germany, it's made in Italy, it's made in Taiwan. These are the things that we have to be doing to provide the types of incomes that people need, so they can go on Amazon, so they can go to Walmart and continue the lifestyle that they've been so accustomed to, myself included.
Dan was making the comment, or John and Dan were talking about the fact of Costco, and we look at Costco and we look at Amazon and we look at Target, and then we look at the Kohl's and other retailers that are in the space where they need a fair amount of foot traffic, whereas Costco does need a foot traffic, but they have the same necessarily model as Amazon. So when you look at the Amazons, the Costcos, they're doing fantastic, and that's also feeding our need for cheaper imported goods, and especially when unemployment's at 15%. However, my question to you is that we lost some time with COVID about bringing industry back to the U.S. I'm a firm believer that the American way is the American built is still a great way. I just happen to think the heartland, the automotive industry, high-end machinery, we've got some of the best blue-collar workers in the world, and we've lost a little bit of time. So how do we start thinking about feasting a little bit less on China and starting to put in more investment and economics into our heartland industries?
Well, I think it has to, a couple of things. Again, it can't be an election cycle thing. It has to be a long-term strategy. Say what you want about China and some of their non-business related challenges. They've had a 5-year plan going back to day one, and they've executed on that plan. I think we in the United States need to come together in academics, in industry, and in government to form a strategy that takes a long-term approach, starting with education in STEM, in engineering, in mathematics, et cetera. So we develop a base of talent that can develop these high-end products. Nearshoring in the next year, I mean, it'll go on to a certain extent, but not to the extent that we need to become fully independent like we have in energy, for example. It's a long-term 5-year strategy, 10-year strategy that transcends election cycles and administrations that people can continue on into the future. It's a generational thing, starting with our youngsters and providing them with the education that they need to make the most of the vast body of talent that is in this country, while continuing to allow people into this country that can make a contribution, earn a living, make a better life for themselves at all different levels. Because this country was built on immigrants, for sure, at all
Dan,
levels.
Dan, I get that, and that's actually where I wanted to go next. Look in the heartland. Look at what we've done with Ford and GM and them making ventilators. As it relates to the healthcare supply chain. Supposedly, and again, I haven't seen a Ford ventilator or a GM ventilator, but that's a real quick turn of a very expensive item that we could potentially export. But I'm worried. I'm worried that that's short term. I'm worried that that won't continue, but it should. And how can we start to move into these high end, perhaps healthcare is a good example,
Mm.
where we really supercharge our export base to take the momentum of what we learned through COVID-19?
Yeah. Well, we live in a capitalist society, so for better or for worse, we have to incentivize people. Now, you talk about nearshoring of let's call it life sciences, pharma. We'll group it all together. And people are talking justifiably about how we became over reliant, not just on PPE, but on ingredients that go into prescription meds, over the counter meds, et cetera. And that's all true. But what sometimes people might not realize, again, going back some years, for just as an example, for this incentivization point here, there was a program going back to the 1970s called Section 936. And basically what it was tax-free treatment for companies that set up on the island of Puerto Rico. And I worked the Puerto Rico trade for a lot of years, been there a zillion times, the whole story. So again, this is not vicarious information that I'm sharing with you. The one industry that just clustered in Puerto Rico was the pharma industry. It was huge. And Puerto Rico is part of the United States, last I heard. So there was a huge growth in Puerto Rico. The United States mainland was the beneficiary. But during the Clinton administration, that Section 936 program was phased out. And what did all those companies do when they didn't have the tax-free benefits of, and I'm talking income tax, corporate tax in Puerto Rico? What did they do? They picked up and they didn't move to China. They started sourcing from China. So in a certain extent, bearing in mind that Puerto Rico isn't a huge place, doesn't have huge production capacity, but to a small extent, we can thank ourselves for that as well, because once again, and so it should, to a certain extent, it all comes down to landed cost. So
That's
the answer is
good.
incentivize people, because if we think just like coastal China has become super expensive, that we're going to bring factories back to the island of Manhattan, it's just way too expensive. So we have this vast middle part of the country where many automotive companies like Honda, like Toyota, like others that have set up in the middle part of the United States, have done quite well, created really good jobs for people, and have benefited dramatically from things like, to take the conversation full circle, the US, Mexico, Canada agreement. Because automotive is the biggest, take agriculture out of it, automotive in terms of produced goods,
Right.
it's the biggest game there is in USMCA. And it's a great example
Perfect.
of how it's worked. And also, to give credit where credit is due, how the USMCA was updated from NAFTA to include what's called the regional value content, meaning raw materials that go into manufacturing an automobile, has to be 75%. It has to come from Canada, the US, and or Mexico. And the labor content is 40 to 45% of the value of a vehicle has to come from somewhere where people are making 16 bucks an hour or more, which
Right.
is to say Canada or the United States. So we'll give credit where credit's due. That's the type of incentivization that we need.
Dan, that's spot on. Michael Weiss from the audience brought up a great comment. You're talking about high-end farmer, you're talking about high-end auto, right? And Michael brought up robotics. Other than some of these, what would be some of the other high-end opportunities that we could perhaps dominate in if we use the right mechanisms that you've outlined in your treaties?
Yeah, well, anything that goes into a high-end production line, the actual equipment itself, so machine tooling, laser-driven, software-based machine tools, all of those things, the high-tech side of things. We talked about drones. The defense industry in the United States is pretty substantial as well. And you have to be careful about where you source some of the raw materials. Some of it you just can't get, or it's not allowed to get. We have to recognize that. But I think anything that involves high-end engineering design, because it's not just the production jobs, which are high-end skilled labor as well. It's all of the other jobs that feed into it: product development, research and development, basic research, applied research, engineering, design, prototyping. These are substantial jobs that exist in the United States today, actually, in companies that outsource some of the lower end manufacturing. So if we can find a way in that high end sense where we can pay people a really good wage and sell products that people want overseas that are highly competitive, it's the only way I see, because no one wants to pay $6 for a pair of nail clippers.
I totally agree. And we had one other comment that Rohan Bhagwat had put forward, and Rohan had said on this topic about U.S. protectionism, where the U.S. would ban goods from China. China has always found a way to export to Taiwan, Vietnam through third countries without knowledge. And again, that's the country of origin issue. But obviously, we're cracking down on country of origin issue, and so our enforcements on country of origin issue are still strong as ever, still as strong as ever, aren't they, Dan?
Yeah, they are. As a short answer, because CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, their database, their algorithms are such that they'll know if a product comes in and let's say it says made in Mexico, but it was really made in China or anywhere else. We don't have to use China as an example.
Excellent
and
point.
I've had experience with this. I've consulted with customers on this. The databases are such with CBP that they'll just know, for example, that XYZ product, that product isn't even made in Mexico. So there's no way that it came from Mexico. So country of origin, not an issue. What I will say, and I'll be emphatic about this, I think it would be a critical mistake to impose even more duties on China now. And the only reason, well, there's a bunch of reasons, but if you go back to the Great Depression, and I'm not suggesting that we're in a depression or that there's going to be one, but one of the ways the government reacted to the Great Depression was through what was called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, where all these tariffs were placed on countries around the world who were exporting from their country into the U.S. Why? To allegedly or theoretically protect the U.S. domestic market, create jobs, etc. It actually had the exact opposite effect and made the Depression even worse. So just based on historical facts, but also understanding globalization the way it works today, that would be a huge mistake, because it's going to hurt the U.S. economy, and the countries overseas, they're just going to retaliate anyway, and it becomes this big testosterone contest about who can grind it out the longest.
Sure.
And I think we would be challenged to survive that type of a contest.
Sure, that's a great point. And I want to remind the audience as we near our 1 hour mark here that you're watching The Future of U.S. Trade with China with your host, Steve Ferreira and Dan Gardner. And one of the questions that came up that Dan Krasenstein brought up is that weapons and guns are a huge export right now from the U.S. And I actually have a story about that. One of my neighbors here in Connecticut runs a high-end precision machining company for the screws and the springs that go into weapons worldwide, and their business is booming, absolutely booming. Very high-end precision-made instrumentation. So I think that even in a high-value place like here in Connecticut, creative industries like that are really helping America go forward. But one of the things I wanted to do just to wrap up our beautiful discussion here today, Dan, is so what do you think will happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks? Do you think Trump will invoke tariffs, or do you think we find another way to work through this?
A short answer, I don't know. And I know most people that you might see on a broadcast or certainly on mainstream TV very rarely say, I don't know. And they might think about that response at some point in the future. I would urge the administration and President Trump and his advisors to not do that, because here's the deal. The Chinese are not paying the tariffs, not the Section 301 tariffs, not any new tariffs. It's paid by the U.S. importer, who then decides whether or not they want to pass that additional cost onto the consumer. It's just disingenuous to tell the American people that the tariffs are paid by the Chinese. Anyone that imports knows this. You have to submit an electronic customs entry to U.S. CBP. Who's the importer? Who's the vendor overseas? What's the country of origin? What's the product? And most importantly, what's the duty rate on that product coming into the country? A customs entry at the end of the day is nothing more than an invoice. And that invoice is payable by the importer. That's just a fact. So let's just start by saying that, let's stop saying that the Chinese are paying the tariffs. With that said, will China suffer in the short, medium to long term because companies find other countries to buy from? Absolutely. That is the essence of tariffs, apart from protecting domestic industries. So that's all very true. And I don't disagree with 95% of what President Trump says, but the Chinese are not paying the tariffs. It's that simple. And it's going to be passed on eventually to the U.S. consumer, who many of whom are out of work. They're suffering from a decrease or a total loss of disposable income. And it's just going to make matters worse, just like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
And I'll give my opinion on it as well. So I tend to agree with you. I also tend to think that high-end FOB valued commodities, I do think that there are some importers that have been able to renegotiate lower FOB costs out of China.
That's true. Yeah.
which is of course helped to offset. And I'm not going to, tip my hand in terms of where my political leanings are, but I certainly think that, Trump has really kind of like said China pays for it, right? And I think that what he might mean, and again, I'm not sure, what he might mean is that we force them to reduce the profits that they're making. It's kind of a backwards argument, and I get the whole thing. I don't think tariffs are the answer either. I think the answer is that everyone needs to watch the Dan Gardner, Steve Ferreira symposium, and then go back on Monday to the war rooms and start making plants in Muncie and Monterey and Guadalajara. What do you think?
Well, I agree with all of that, but I don't know what President Trump is going to do in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But I can tell you what I'm going to do in the next 2 to 3 hours. And I'm going to step outside and have a few spritzers with my now legal age son, who will be 22 in June, and socially distance with the rest of our family, and maybe throw a burger on the grill and focus on what's important.
Well, I think you have your heart in the right place. And I want to thank you, Dan, my friend, for joining me on this very provocative discussion. We covered a lot of different points, and certainly
it was great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you listen, it means the world to me. Certainly as part of the OK Boomer Live TV series that I'm sponsoring on LinkedIn Live as a broadcaster, your comments and questions are important. Anything you need through Dan, just connect with him on LinkedIn. Daniel Gardner, Trade Facilitators. And I'm Steve Ferreira from Ocean Audit, signing off, wishing you a very healthy and safe weekend to you and your families. And to all my followers and everyone that joined in today, thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next broadcast of OK Boomer Live. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there.
Happy Mother's Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.